So in my previous video, I said I believed any explanation that emphasizes the role of ideology in the genocide must explain why an extremist ideology prevailed over the multiple alternate moderate ideologies that also existed. So why then did moderates lose the power struggle to extremists in Rwanda? I'll offer a simple theory built in 3 stages. But before I explain it, let me define what I mean by extremist and moderate. So in the context of Rwanda's war and genocide, an extremist was someone who first saw the war in ethnically essentialist terms. It was a conflict between Hutu and Tutsi, not between the government and rebels. Second, someone who favored violent confrontation over negotiated peace. We don't talk, we fight back. And third, someone who believed that targeting civilians was permissible. A moderate, in contrast, was an individual who held the opposing views. And of course, these attitudes are continuous and varied in intensity. All right, so back to the model, the 3-stage model of extremist moderate contestation. So in stage 1, we have fracturing. In the face of a new security threat, such as an armed invasion marking the start of a civil war, as occurred in Rwanda, the attacked actor, typically the government, fractures into hardliner and moderate factions, which disagree over how to respond to the threat. So the between-group contestation, the war, the conflict between the rebels and the government, triggers within-group contestation, the conflict between extremists and moderates within the government. The extremists believe in coercion, a violent escalatory response. The moderate faction advocates negotiation or a de-escalatory response. So stage 2 is escalation. So the threat either escalates or de-escalates depending on the external constraints operating on each faction. If the external constraints on extremists are weak, the attacked actor will choose a coercive response to the provocation. This response, in turn, will provoke a coercive response from the other actor, the rebels, if it too has weak external constraints acting on its extremist faction. In other words, the conflict will escalate. The moderate position is weakened and the hardliner position is strengthened. So the within-group contestation and the between-group contestation mutually drive each other if there are no external constraints to stop the conflict escalating. And this brings us to the 3rd and final stage of the model, resolution. So as the between-group conflict escalates, the internal conflict between extremists and moderates will ultimately resolve according to their relative material capabilities. If extremists are in a stronger position structurally, they will simply prevail over moderates. So let's apply this model to Rwanda. We can divide the contestation between moderates and extremists into 2 time periods, before and after the president's assassination. Before his death, neither moderates nor extremists clearly dominated within the regime. Their relative positions had fluctuated with the fortunes of the war. After the president was killed, however, things changed. The rebels, the RPF, were widely believed by Rwandans to have been behind the assassination, and this tilted the balance of power in the extremists' favor. They had been right to distrust the rebels. And the power vacuum created in the government side immediately triggered a power struggle. The power vacuum triggered a power struggle between moderates and extremists. There were few external constraints on the extremists at either the domestic or at the international levels. At the international level, for example, the UN initially refused to take sides, claiming it must be neutral, and it also took time to recognize and call the violence and denounce it as genocide. And in fact, they took steps to draw down the UN peacekeeping mission. All of these decisions worked to the extremists' advantage. So in the absence of an external constraint, the power struggle between extremists and moderates resolved according to the relative material capabilities of each faction. Neither faction held positional advantage. Both had command of important positions of authority after the president was killed. However, the extremists had a coercive advantage. They commanded superior forces in the capital. The Presidential Guard, the Para-Commando Battalion, and the Reconnaissance Battalion were all loyal to the extremists. In other words, the moderates were simply outgunned. And this, ultimately, is why an extremist ideology came to prevail over a more moderate one in Rwanda after the president was killed.